Well, good morning, everyone. How is everyone today?
All right.
Good, good. Um, Cassidy, like we talked about last week, is working on some new formats, and so we'll start playing with stuff like that. In my opinion, this is all experimentation, and so we'll be playing around with different formats, and we just start with one thing and try another, and we'll see where it all goes. I have no idea how much appetite there is for any of this, but we'll play it as long as we all want to play it together. Anybody want to volunteer to be the MC for this morning?
Nobody else, I can jump in.
All right, Valerie, you're becoming a regular. Um, okay. Any? Well, let's just jump in and again, part of why I like Discord for doing something like this is that at least there's the potential for a little bit of back and forth and dialogue. Whereas when I see how question and answer sessions are usually done on YouTube. You can read the Patreon or the super chats or something like that, and there isn't as much participation from you all, and so that's part of what I'm looking for. And again, we talked last week about the possibility of doing something like a lightning round where I try to limit answers to 2 minutes. We could play with something like that, but for now, maybe we'll just begin. So I don't know, Valerie, if you had a chance to look at. Sometimes,
Um,
sometimes
Go
people
ahead.
quote post questions during the week, and I try to answer them, um, and in text, which is fine. So again, we'll just see where this goes. So go ahead, Valerie. You can, you can lead us.
Okay. I think I have a very long question from the 29th, so we can start with that one if you want.
Okay.
Um, it's kind of complicated, but I'll do my best to read through it. It's from Christian Golden, and he says, "Hello, Paul. My Twitter handle is, uh, and we have a brief interaction earlier today that I'd like to maybe expand upon. The discussion revolved around a tweet you had retweeted and commented on, wherein the original tweeter suggested that the point of all science and philosophy was to use data and arguments to challenge the lived experience of individuals. Your response was something to the effect of, even arguments derived from scientific philosophical processes must be instantiated at some place and at some time, which I think suggested that the qualitative difference between scientific arguments and lived experience arguments is, in fact, much less than scientific philosophical people might claim. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, if there's any qualitative difference at all. Mostly, I suppose your point was to show the scientific claim that it draws its conclusion from nowhere, meaning that they come utterly unbiased, I suppose, is necessarily faulty since the conclusions are drawn from a process that both executes over time and at various places and originates from a time and place, and maybe more importantly, a self. My question is, to what extent, if at all, should a qualitative distinction be drawn between scientific argument and lived experience argument? Or rather, do we have their respective jurisdiction? Or do they have their respective jurisdiction, so to speak? Or some combination of all the above?
No, no. That was a great question, and the question sort of followed on some of the videos, some of my more recent videos, where I got into this a little bit. So, if you look at the Pageauian observation that people are not only multitudes inside but also outside among us, the question of data samples I think, helps in this. In some ways, testimony of lived experiences are the voicing of what we would look upon as an individual's consciousness congress. That my lived experience this morning has been that the governor of the state of California is tyrannical by ordering churches to not sing even though they can meet. Okay? So there's a little piece of data of lived experience. Now, not without justification do we have this habit of prioritizing, prioritizing statistical data over the data of lived experience. Both are data, okay? And the statistical data are justifiable attempts to transcend lived individual experience. Now, part of what's happened in the whole discussion surrounding critical theory is that critical race theory, critical theory that deals with oppression, inverts that and says that the proper sample is of one, and lived experience ought not to be denied. A conflict between a parent and child is often a conflict over data samples. The child might protest, "You're being unfair." And the parent has whole different metrics of fairness, and in many cases, fairness is a function of the kinds of data samples we are appealing to. So I think the postmodern impulse is to, I think, again, justifiably cast a bit of skepticism over certain data samples. For example, if anybody's watching all of the numbers that are being generated following the COVID-19 epidemic, we see all of this data that, well, cases in California are rising. Now, most people, if they begin to drill a little deeper into the data, will notice that half of the deaths in California are coming out of nursing homes. Oh, well, now suddenly my appropriation of the data is being filtered, obviously and always, through my lived experience. So scientific arguments are important, but data is data. Lived experience is data, and is very contextual. For example, if you maybe you're watching the news and seeing all of these riots and broken windows, and so you're afraid to leave your home. Well, you might be watching TV in the middle of a Montana or Alberta prairie, and there's no unrest around your home. So all of this appropriation of data has to be seen within context. And so when I hear, for example, Brett Weinstein continuing to appeal to data in resistance to lived experience, well, that's fair. But none of us live in a world of simple data. All of us live in a world of context. So Vervaekean relevance realization is of utmost importance. The world is a near infinite set of potential data sets. Which data sets are relevant to the actions I'm about to take now? So you can bring in Jordan Peterson. So to what extent, if at all, should a qualitative distinction be drawn between scientific arguments and lived experience arguments? That's a good question. I would tend to discount the qualitative experience and say that in some ways it's a quantitative difference, in that lived experience is a it's a data set of one. But again, if you drill down in a Pageauian manner, it's a data set of my consciousness Congress. One day I feel oppressed by the governor of California. The next day I think California is a lovely, free place to live. Lived experience is terribly dependent upon consciousness. And this is why we see the news media loving to show polls of, well, do you believe America is on the right track or wrong track? Well, okay, but not only do you have the problem of sample that you're selecting a sample of everybody right now at this moment, and someone might have won the lottery and feels like this is a wonderful country to live in. Well, that's a terribly small data set of studied lottery winners right after they won the lottery, not just 3 years after they won the lottery and paid all those taxes and blew all that money. So it's just a function of the difficulty that we as human beings have in seeing the world. And again, the world is far too large for us to see. We have this is Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris. We have a priori structures through which we filter the data. We have biases that have been developed historically through our biology, through our cultures, to continue to filter this data. All of those biases are fundamental to our capacity to interact with the world productively towards certain ends, rationally, if you will. And so a lot of these distinctions that we draw, which look hard and fast between lived experiences and science, are not necessarily qualitative, but quantitative. And the difficulty that we have is, in some ways, the Vervaekean relevance realization question. What should we do this Sunday in church? Should we cancel church because church just isn't worth it if there is no singing? Should I kneecap grandma if she starts humming Amazing Grace? You've got to read the room. You've got to figure out the data. And on the basis of that, you make a decision, which is good, bad, right, or wrong, and you act in the world. It's, I'm incredibly indebted to Peterson and Vervaeke and Brett Weinstein and all of you in terms of helping me process and get, I think, a little bigger picture of the world than I had before. So I'd say that's my attempt to answer that question. Oh, did I lose everyone? Okay. So, Valerie, are you still there? You're muted.
Sorry, I was muted. I apologize.
Okay.
I apologize. I was asking the room if anybody had any questions and not realizing I was muted. Okay. Does anybody in the room have a question for Paul? Nope. Okay, so we'll go ahead and read the next question. What are some of the most important ways you can apply 1 John 4:18 about fear and its preceding verses on being identified in love to your perspective and of and experience with the power and authorities referenced in Ephesians 6:12?
Okay, let's take a look at the two relevant passages. 1 John 4. The book of 1 John is you can find the Sunday school class that I did on the Johannine epistles on the church's YouTube channel. The Johannine epistles are a fascinating group of books, and the scholarship around them is fascinating. So after Paul, what's in academic circles sometimes called the Johannine corpus, mean 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the Gospel of John, in the book of Revelation all come out of, well, either the same author or a particular community, and they often strike, just as the Gospel of John is quite different from the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Johannine epistles are quite different from the Pauline epistles. And 2nd John and 3rd John in particular are, well, 2nd John and 3rd John are quite clearly letters, fairly brief letters. 2nd John to the elder to the chosen, to the lady chosen by God and her children. And again, I talk about that. 3rd John, the elder to my dear friend Gaius, whom I love in truth. And then you get into 1st John, and there's a tremendous amount of discussion as to what exactly is 1st John. And so I followed Howard Marshall's admonition. If you're going to study the letters of John, read 2nd John and then 3rd John and then 1st John. Some scholars wonder if the what we call 1st John isn't an addendum to the Gospel of John to sort of hedge it against a way of reading the Gospel of John in a rather Gnostic light. The first John is full of antitheses. And in fact, all the letters of John are full of antitheses. This is where we get a lot of antichrist language and warnings about the devil. 1 John 1, dear children, this is the last hour, as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming. Even now antichrists have come. This is how we know it is the last hour. And so, the book has a particularly apocalyptic flavor. Now, for the section that 1 John 4:18 is in goes like this. Dear friends, let us love one another, for love comes from God. Everyone who loves has been born of God and knows God. Whoever does not know God, whoever does not love does not know God, because God is love. And the book loves talking in these categoricals. And so I find that modern readers are if they just dip in for a phrase, they're tremendously inspired. But other modern readers dip in and read the book and don't quite know what to do with it. Because on one hand, you have all this talk of love and God and, oh, isn't that wonderful? And then the book is so antithetical. This is how God God showed his love to us. He sent his one and only Son into the world that we might live through him. This is love. Not that we loved God, but that he loved us, and sent his Son as an atoning sacrifice for our sins. Dear children, since God so loved us, we ought to love one another. No one has seen God, but if we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is made complete in us. Again, someone who sort of wants to shed off Christian particularism might read that passage and say, look, God is love, so therefore love is God. But the first epistle of John won't really go there. This is how we know that we love, that we live in him and he in us. He has given us his Spirit. And we have seen and testify that the Father has sent his Son to be the Savior of the world. If anyone acknowledges that Jesus is the Son of God, God lives in them and they in God. So we know and rely on the love God has for us. God is love. Whoever lives in love lives in God and God in them. This is how love is made complete among us, so that we have confidence on the day of judgment. In this world, we are like Jesus. There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out fear, because fear has to do with punishment. The one who fears is not made perfect in love. We love because he first loved us. Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister, that's the NIV adding sister, is a liar. But now, in the context of these books, brother and sister have a pretty strong connection to the others that share your religious tribe. Because if you read more of the books, these brothers or sisters are people who have broken away from the tribe, defected from the tribe. Whoever claims to love God yet hates his brother or sister is a liar. And whoever does not love their brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God, whom they have not seen. And he has given this commandment: anyone who loves God must also love their brother and sister. Now, what people generally do today is sort of broaden that out to other human beings. And that's not a bad broadening. It's Jesus who says, love your enemies. But in this context, he has a particular thing. So John 4:18 says, well, true love casts out fear. The vision of the epistle of John, of 1 John, is that those in God's loving embrace should be completely free of anxiety, because the love of God expressed by the love within that group of Christ followers is free from fear. But if you read the rest of the letter, the same writer is completely capable of castigating those who he sees as having betrayed their little group and become, in fact, Antichrist. So that's the context of John 4:18. Now, how does this relate to Ephesians 6:28? Well, obviously, Paul sees the world as, in many ways, being as being imprisoned by ideas, principalities, and powers. Not merely what we would call ideas, but again, it's interesting that we've had the question about angels and demons multiple times in these question and answer. And so people are bound by principalities and powers. Jordan Peterson would say people are bound by ideology. Modernist materialists might look at principalities and powers and imagine they're merely ideological. The Apostle Paul affords them a good bit more ontology, but we shouldn't disconnect them necessarily from ideology. So how to sync the really radical, categorical messages of 1 John about God and love, but the equally radical and categorical antithetical messages in 1 John about Antichrist with Ephesians 6. Well, I think perhaps a bridge or a way of doing that would be understanding that the Apostle Paul also sees people who, in the words of Jordan Peterson, are possessed by an ideology as, in some ways, being subject to the spirit of Antichrist. And so in that sense, human beings that the Epistle of John would denounce as children of Satan can also be seen as possessed and controlled by Satan. So it's easy to see the difference between these two readings, but I don't think it's impossible to understand how one well of ideas could yield both expressions. Because Paul is by no means lacking in moments when he will, for example, suggest that those Judaizers that he is fulminating against should go all the way with the knife and not only cut off the foreskin, but cut off the rest of the junk as well. So, that's the way they talked. And they give expression to many of these complex and competing ideas.
Well said. Thank you very much. So let's take another question from the voice chat. Anybody have a question for Paul? Okay, we can go to another question from the text chat. When do we turn the cheek? When do we ask God to destroy our enemy? And when do we take physical action?
That's a good question. I am not a pacifist. Jesus overturned money changers. At the same time, when Peter wielded a sword in the Garden of Gethsemane, he restored the ear to the servant of the high priest. We do not find Christians in the New Testament picking up the sword. We do find them fleeing persecution. We do find God, in the case of Ananias and Sapphira, deciding to end the life of a couple of rebels within the church. I think, again, the actions we take call for wisdom, and we are held accountable for the actions that we take. I'm not a pacifist. I think that the state has the power of the sword, and along with what the Apostle Paul said, and it has that power to keep order. The state will always do an imperfect job of maintaining order and will never perfectly exemplify justice. And Christians, I think, should participate, especially in a democratic context, in helping states improve their embodiment of justice. But I think a Christian, and this is where I would differ with pacifists, I think a Christian can serve in the police and armed forces. I think in many cases, when a Christian is wronged when a Christian is wronged, it is the role of the state, in a sense, as a proxy for God, but also God himself, to do justice. So the ongoing admonitions of Jesus to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us, I think are where we start. I think it is permissible for Christians to use force to defend the weak. If someone were to break into my house, I would likely use, if I found that words would fail, I would likely use force and strength to restrain an aggressor from hurting my family. There was an incident once when I walked into the supermarket and I watched a security guard and the manager start to power up on a homeless person that was not doing well at that moment, not in his right mind. And because I had a lot of experience with mental illness and homeless people, I stepped in and began talking to this individual, and the manager and security guard seemed to welcome my intervention. And so I was pretty much able to talk the whole situation through, where he didn't quite have enough money to buy his beer. We took a little collection up at the register. He was able to get his beer. He was able to walk his bike out of the supermarket, and he didn't have to go to jail. He was able to get his beer. The security guard didn't have to get into a scuffle, and the manager didn't have to ban him. Everyone in this context were of a different race. Now, I think the church has wrestled with these issues for as long as we've had the church. And as is often the case, the way the church wrestles through these issues is not only through our own internal consciousness congresses, weighing the varying biblical passages that seem to give expression to different values within the kingdom, but sometimes different segments within the church as a body expressing these values. And so when it comes to the use of force, the Christian church has had various voices. And sometimes it has been important that the government uses force to preserve order and to create a context in which justice and the gospel can go out. And sometimes Christians have taken up arms against the government, and sometimes Christians have taken up arms in defense of themselves. And so, while I am not a pacifist, I think in most cases, we first start with talk. And we first start with absorbing, especially offensive words and bruises to our ego. And we use that power of Christ that he manifests so clearly of absorbing insults and injury, because the mockers who put him on a cross did not understand what they were doing. There will be times when Christians need to take measures, and I think Christians who are soldiers and police officers do so under the state. But as Peter and Paul, both of who were killed by tyrannical governments, bore witness, I think in a full-blown historical Christianity, those who wield the power of the state as proxy for God will be held accountable for the ways that they have not done justice in the world. And so when in the Old Testament as well as in the New, we get the admonition, justice is mine, saith the Lord, I will repay, that's our plan A. And just as the saints under the altar in the book of Revelation cried out for the justice of that fearful Lamb and the one upon the throne, that reality is present with us too. And so that's why I'm not a pacifist, but I am not going to silence the pacifists, but listen to them, because all of these voices, I think, have a place for Christians to listen to, and in each particular historical context, try to express as best we can what God would have us do.
That was really well said. Thank you, Paul. We'll take another question from the voice chat, see if anybody has any questions of their own or a follow-up question.
Yeah, I would like to follow up on that. Paul, one of the reasons I love you is reading your Facebook posts about Daniel. I've also had way more than my fair share of experience with mental illness and homelessness. I actually worked at a homeless shelter for a while, and I'm really wondering at what you did there, because one of the things I've really struggled with is when are we enabling as opposed to helping, and when is it better to let somebody who's an alcoholic really hit bottom, as in ending up in jail or not, so that, especially if they have mental health issues, so that they do get their medications, they do get help. So I was just wondering about your thinking when you took up the collection there.
Well, so Daniel was lived against my door for about 6 years. I went on vacation, and when I was around, I pretty much could manage Daniel, not always successfully. There were many days that he threatened my life, would throw things against the door, but I'm, 6'4", 200 plus pounds. He never attacked me. When I was gone and senior member of the church, Daniel would strip metal and leave his mess here, and the senior member of the church, who with his disabled son cuts the grass, started to clean up and throw away Daniel's stuff. Daniel came back, got angry, attacked him. Daniel spent 2 years in a combination of locked psychiatric wards, jail, and prison. Daniel was let out, with a restraining order that he can't be here, and Daniel has violated that restraining order repeatedly. I have, in a number of cases, called his parole officer, and in fact, just last night, he has a new parole officer. I had a conversation between Daniel and his parole officer, again, about the situation. This morning, I walked to church, and who's sitting out in front of my door but Daniel? And his bipolar rhythms. 3 days ago, he would say to me, "I haven't slept for 2 days." That means he's manic. Yesterday, he was so let's say manic is noon, is 12. Yesterday, he was about 3 o'clock. He's coming down from his mania. He's a bit more sane, a bit more balanced. This morning, when I got to church, he was at about 4:30. "I hate life. I hate you. I'm going to leave." And then he cussed me out. And, I mean, I've been through this hundreds of times with Daniel. Almost everything that can be tried with him has been tried. He's maintained sobriety for years of his life, sufficient to the end that for a while he maintained a wife and had 4 children with her. That marriage broke up. He worked in the mental health field for a while. He, over the last 8 years of his life, has basically given himself over to self-medication through alcohol and pot and anything else he can get his hands on. And part of the reason for his homelessness is he doesn't want to spend his money on housing when what he really wants to spend his money on is beer. And so yesterday we had a conversation. He's getting more in touch, and he's getting more sympathetic to the idea of getting housing provided by the state that would leave him his money to drink his beer. We've done this for a while over this past year, at least once. The difficulty is that he tends to get picked on by other people, which is why he prefers to live alone, and his drinking and his mood swings tend to make him awfully difficult to live with, as I know well. If there was an easy answer to this, it would have been solved. In my experience with many individuals like him, I don't know that we have an answer under the sun. He's been imprisoned. He's been in locked facilities. He's been medicated. He's been on and off legal drugs for his condition. He's fairly good at managing himself with beer. When he drinks more heavily or gets into harder drugs, things get a little out of whack. But he lives a very miserable existence. And for the most part, what I have to offer him is comfort. And so he and I sort of have an arrangement. I facilitate him being able to keep in touch with his parents, his elderly parents in Utah. We kind of have a revolving fund. I have about $100 that over the course of the month I'll loan out to him, and then when he gets paid at the beginning of the month, he'll pay it back to me. He's got excellent credit. I wish I had the wisdom to answer this enabling versus helping conversation. But I have tried just about everything with how many different cases. And in many ways, the best I can do is see what I can do to help them have the best day they can today, and maybe keep an eye open towards encouraging them for a better day tomorrow. So when Daniel and his probation officer and I had that conversation last night, Daniel wasn't happy with the conversation because I re-emphasized to the probation officer he can't camp here. And that's why Daniel was annoyed with me this morning. Okay, I'll leave, because Daniel knows my schedule well enough to know that if I'm not around to enforce the order, then, he'll camp here. So the probation officer also doesn't want to see Daniel in jail. The state doesn't want to see Daniel in jail. Everybody understands that jail isn't the best place for Daniel. Is a locked facility a better place for Daniel? I don't know. I have no answers for these questions. And so I do the best I can day in and day out in obedience to my God, who tells a story of Lazarus and the rich man. And for years I had to step over Daniel. And did I want to be the rich man? Who knows what condition Lazarus was in that brought him to begging. We embroider the poor and the homeless at a distance, and then finally, when they're in our face, we banish them as the nuisance that they are. So, boy, I'll tell you. And I think we as a church need to live in this space and work in this space, because finally we bear witness to Christ. We do not have the power. I do not have the power to bring in God's kingdom to Daniel. And I praise God for psychiatrists and psychologists and mental health workers that can help in many ways to contextualize and afford some semblance of decency. But at the same time, there's human feces along the path to my office, and Daniel drops drawers, on Florin Road regularly, and I have no answer to any of this. And I have involved myself in all of the relevant city and county officials that are supposed to have imagined solutions to this, and they have none. So I keep trying to be faithful with him the best way I know how. And I don't know that Christians are called to anything more.
I'm guessing you know this, but just for the audience, over the past 10 years, there's been a lot of progress with new medications coming out, especially for bipolar. And they've actually started using ECT again, electroconvulsive therapy. And I know it's been very helpful for some people. So just in case people didn't know.
Yeah, I've seen... There's another member of my congregation who, he spent decades lying down in a dark room in the middle of Nevada. And electroconvulsive therapy gave him a couple of years of reprieve. But my experience with the medical establishment and mental health is very much hit or miss. They try things because they don't know, and so that's the way forward. But it's we call it a science, and I think we suggest it might be more than it often is.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was really well put. Next question I have is, I asked a fundamental Baptist friend if he would deny that the walls of Jericho fell down if a man held a gun to his head. He responded that he wouldn't, and he would rather be shot, because any attack on the Bible is an attack on one's own faith. What would you infer about the person's relationship with the Bible, and how is it different than your relationship with it? Thank you for your time.
I don't think this is finally an issue with the Bible. Now, as Jordan Peterson says, people don't like being poked in their axioms. And these kinds of questions are ways of poking people in their axioms. And one of the things that impressed me early on about Jordan Peterson was that I thought he had a compassionate and realistic take towards the spirit of fundamentalism. Now, I think none of our approximations and abilities to represent the world in all of its glory and complexity will finally resolve all of the issues that we come upon. The questions like this are usually traps laid by people who want to mock and deride people's systems for figuring out the world. Well, it gets bandied about on both sides, and it's an unhelpful game. I think we know. What's the goal here? To the best of my knowledge, God doesn't determine our eternal destinies based on the particular school in which we find ourselves interpreting the Bible. Read Augustine, read Calvin, read church fathers. Figuring out how to represent history is tremendously hard. It always involves selection. It always involves reducing the world into a stream of sounds and words that represent and elicit ideas and images in others. It's amazing that this stuff works at all. So the Bible clearly represents itself as relating history. How those representations are related is something well worth studying. And in a sense, when this person says that they would rather take a bullet than to deny the falling of the walls of Jericho at the sound of the trumpets of Israel, what do those words represent? Those words represent that this person intends to be loyal to his Lord. And proxy it up in whatever silly way you want. That's the core of his confession. Now, you might mock him for staking that claim on the walls of Jericho, but that's not really what the question is about, and it's not really what the answer is about. And so, these little gotcha games can be fun, but if you understand the game, they're fairly pointless. Maybe we would have a more productive conversation talking about how we attempt to grasp and represent history through language and how we should live in the world. Now, to me, as I've said many times on my channel, I believe that when Jesus came out of that grave and when he appeared in that upper room, that Thomas saw wounds in his hands and a hole in his side. And I believe that one day I will see those wounds and those wounds and scar with whatever eyes and whatever mechanisms I will possess at that moment to see him. All of that language is representation. We never get away from representation. But we also have consciousness, and I believe that the representation and the consciousness do go together. And so, yeah, that's my faith, and I hope to bear witness in such a way that when I see Jesus, he won't say, "You were ashamed of me." Having said that, in the manifest ways that I sin, I shame him and show my cowardice. So far be it from me to start pointing fingers at a mocked fundamentalist. And may we also be gracious to esteemed elites who see such fundamentalism as infantile. All of us human beings see the world through the glass darkly, and I anticipate one day I'll be able to see it more clearly.
All right, let's open it up to the room. Does anybody have a question for Paul or a follow-up question? Okay. We got another question from Sherry. Could you explain again how John Vervaeke's idea of relevance realization maps onto your concept of God? I thought I remember you talking about this. If I have it wrong, my apologies.
John's relevance realization is a really clever and interesting idea. And there's a double nature to it. And that's found in that word realization. I mean, the word relevance very much gets into the idea of fittedness. Realization has a double edge to it because it can both be conscious realization, such as insight, or it can be material realization. And so I found his lecture and his observations connecting Darwinistic evolution to relevance realization to be powerful and insightful, because in a sense all surviving creatures realize a relevant adaptation. Now, God is far larger. I mean, God is God number one and God number two. Relevance realization in some ways is much more directly mapped onto something like general intelligence, where it's the capacity to see and pursue the productive path into the future. So, and I asked John, and on one of my conversations, there's sort of a black box nature to his relevance realization, and I understand how that can sound pejorative. All truly foundational things have a black box nature to them. It's a presuppositional element that we just sort of can't get behind. And so I have difficulty answering the question, not necessarily because of relevance realization, but because of how utterly difficult it is to represent God. And our Jewish friends have a point in their circumlocutions. So, because it's so difficult. But I don't know, that's kind of the best I can do. But I do not see, to the degree that we practice relevance realizations, we are children of God, and in some ways his relevance realization lines up with capital R reason in C.S. Lewis's Miracles. But that's I guess that's the best I can do for now.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I probably got that wrong, so that's probably why you're struggling to answer.
Okay.
I misunderstood.
Does anybody have a follow-up question or another question for Paul in the voice chat? Okay, well, maybe a little later. Alrighty, the next question in the text chat. Are you aware of the Son of Man controversy among Bible scholars? Do you have any thoughts? What role does linguistic analysis and historical research play in faith? Should it play more or less of a part in our lives? Is it spiritual, navel-gazing, or important to us?
Well, I haven't followed the Son of Man controversy closely. We're first acquainted with that term in the book of Daniel, and it's in the book of Daniel. Daniel, of course, is in Hebrew and Aramaic, and then Greek. I mean, the book of Daniel is a dicey book as it is. It's just common. Everyone understood that the that this Son of Man that comes with the clouds and is given an eternal kingdom from the Ancient of Days is, we might call a humanoid. But the Gospels, Jesus in the Gospels seems to appropriate this, and it seems likely that the history of reading and tradition between the authorship of the book of Daniel and its first century readers, they had the capacity to understand something of what Jesus is saying. And, I've, for years, as a preacher, you have to keep reading and rereading the Gospels, always struck at the times and ways that Jesus slips into Son of Man talk. You'll find high status and celebrity persons begin to refer themselves in the third person, because in a sense their name, and it might be a pen name, like George Orwell instead of Eric Blair, the name George Orwell means something different from the name Eric Blair, and names have that kind of power and functionality. So Jesus keeps talking about the Son of Man, and he's clearly hyperlinking to the context of Daniel 7. So now, in terms of biblical scholarship, Jonathan Peugeot once basically said that, all these biblical commentaries are garbage. I understand his point. One of my great frustrations in divinity school was, at that point in time, most of the Bible commentaries could get hopelessly lost in source criticism, in all sorts of academic tail chasing that didn't really help a preacher bring the Bible as Word of God to the congregation. But at the same time, there are also learnings in these various schools. I think the literary and symbolic schools of interpretation that have risen over the last half century have been far more helpful. So, what role does linguistic analysis and historical research play in the life of faith? I have found that for many people, those disciplines are not necessarily helpful, and even in some cases hazardous to their resistance to certain modernist frames from which these interpretive methods apply. A lot of this interpretation was developed in an attempt to sort of save the Bible from the deconstructions of modernity. But I think if we understand that all of our communication and representation have the kinds of challenges that texts have, the Bible stands up amazingly well to them as compared to so many other texts. So those were as a young seminarian, as a young preacher, those were the kinds of issues I had to wade through. And I decided to not be scared by them, but also to understand that how so often a lot of people get tripped up in them. I don't know, should play more or less a part of life. So maybe, Jacob, you have something more you want to add, or you want to make this a little more specific. It's certainly not spiritual navel gazing. I think it's more modernistic angst.
Well, I just personally, I do a lot of this textual and historical and theology, and I wonder, am I just kind of indulging my own personal wishes instead of, like, would it be better if I was just volunteering at a homeless shelter. Is it keeping me from being a productive servant?
Well, I think that's not a question really of the. I would ask, okay, why something in you is probably finding that sort of interpretive toolkit helpful, or you wouldn't be doing it. Or maybe you're indulging a certain degree of doubt in which maybe you'll want to do it less, or you have to do it more to get through it and see through it. It sounds more like your question then is one of stewardship of time. But at the same time, there's a certain justification for the fact that you're drawn to it. And there's a relevance realization thing happening in you. So you might try and find out what about this method of interpretation is important. I think for me, part of it is trying to maintain a whole vision of the world that can include modernist voices and not simply exclude them because, here's my line, maybe a fundamentalist frame. Here I'm going to exclude these modernist voices. I'd rather include them, but I'd like to keep them on a leash.
By that, do you mean coming from a pre-modern worldview or postmodern? Because I consider myself kind of pre-modern.
Well, I think most pre-moderns today are likely postmodern, pre-modern, in the sense that you looked at modernity and said, you're not all that great, and you were able to appreciate the pre-modern. So, but even pre-moderns are in a sense innocent of modernity. Postmoderns may glory in their pre-modernism, but they came through the other side of modernity. So I think Jonathan Peugeot is in many ways like that too, and Jordan Peterson. And I know that ticks off a lot of people when they say, Jordan Peterson is postmodern. It's awfully hard to be an educated person today and not use the tools of postmodernity to not only deconstruct modernity, but postmodernity as well.
Well, we can go to another question. Does anybody from the voice chat have a question for Paul?
Hi, Paul. This is Shane.
Hey, Shane. How are you?
Anxious. So this protesting and rioting has gone on for a month, and it doesn't seem to be de-escalating at all, and this is making me really anxious. So I just wanted to know what's your pastoral advice on dealing with anxiety about an uncertain future, and I guess feeling powerless to do anything about it.
I think the first thing is limit your screen time, especially social media and TV news. Find good written sources for the news you want to digest, and look for longer analysis rather than shorter hot takes that tend to stimulate the anxiety causing areas of our matrix. I think and this is especially challenging, I don't think it's an accident that all of this is happening at the same time that churches are really suppressed. Worship, being with normal people, being with family and friends is really important for our nervous systems to calibrate reality. Unless in your work life you have responsibilities that are really getting impacted by these areas, people should try to live quietly, find ways to stay informed, but try to live quiet lives, as the Apostle Paul admonishes. If it is part of your work, well, then you've got a double problem, because you're probably going to have to work in a very disciplined way to counter the effects of the stresses and the chaos we're under, and deepen your relationship with Christ and your trust in Him, and use that as a leverage against the chaos of the world. I don't know if that helps. You can certainly pursue this, Shane.
Okay, thanks for your answer.
Yeah. It's limited, I know. I wish I had it's you trust in Jesus more than you trust yourself. And develop, what do you need to do to develop your trust in Him? That the implicit script in your mind of the way the world should go is not God's. And He is good and can be trusted. And so finally, you're not your own, but you belong body and soul in life and in death to Him. That's our only comfort in life and in death.
Well said. Thank you. So, next question. Recently, Jordan Peterson updated his status on a podcast of what was happening to him and his family. Any thoughts on this? Thank you for your time, Pastor Paul.
Yeah. Jordan Peterson's podcast got almost 1 million views in the first day. I was glad to see it. It's a sign of recovery. It's a sign of recognition to his following that people care about him. It's a generous move to those who care about him to give us a little window in the fact that he is recovering, and it's a sobering view to see how long it took for him to get to this place. So everything that, his family has said about him is in many ways verified by that little conversation. I continue to pray for him. I was charmed to see the love that he has for his daughter, and she for him. Part of probably the most touching part of 12 Rules for Life is the end. And as a parent, I could identify with Peterson and the love for a suffering child. And now here she is heroically doing what she can for her struggling father. As someone commented here, the daughter has gone into the underworld to rescue her father, and so my prayers for their continued recovery are with them. Piggybacking on Shane's question, it's one thing for many of us to see this all around us and even to have this chaos in our family and churches. It's a whole nother layer to live as Jordan Peterson did and be the center of attention for powerful social actors attacking him as they were. Wow. If Jordan Peterson lives the rest of his life quietly with his family, I would not hold that against him in any way, shape, or form. He certainly owes us nothing. And what he has given us has cost him plenty. I think his voice is important. I would have loved to see him back in the game, as it were. But he was pretty fragile. And he has a long ways to go. And to be thrown back into the rough and tumble where he was before, I don't wish that on anybody. So my prayers are with him.
Could I suggest we actually pray for him?
Sure. I'll say I pray for him. Lord, I thank you for the opportunity to pray. And I thank you for the role that Jordan Peterson has had in my life. This unusual professor of psychology in Toronto who had the temerity to speak his mind as he did and cause such an uproar, but also the generosity and insight to bring out his years of reflection and learning to the world about meaning and purpose and psychology, and his reflections on the Bible, which I've not only benefited from his insight directly, but from the communities that he created in his wake, to have been so blessed by the opportunity to share myself and with them. So Lord, in my opinion, you have used him mightily and well over the last number of years. And Lord, I pray for him and his family. He and his wife have had terrible medical situations over the last couple of years. And his daughter has lived with them, with her own, all of her life. And she, as a young mother, is struggling to care for her father and her mother and keep him alive. And so far, so good. He has survived the withdrawal from the benzos, and he is in a place now where he is recovering in Serbia, of all places. And I thank you, Lord, that they had the financial resources to pursue these doctors, and I thank you, Lord, that they have found a degree of healing. Lord, I pray that you would continue to protect and heal him, and give him the strength to engage in the work that he so clearly enjoys doing, which is to, in one way or another, bring meaning and wholeness to the lives of millions of men and women who are suffering from the nihilism of the meaning crisis. So I pray, Lord, that you would, in fact, heal him, continue to bring around him the resources he needs to heal, and continue to knit him back together. And Lord, I believe that Jesus is the Good Shepherd and the divine physician. And I pray, Lord, that your Holy Spirit would continue to work in his heart and in his life, and bring him to the full potential of what your calling and your plan for him requires of him. And I ask these things in the name of Jesus. Amen.
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 Okay. We have another question from the text chat. If someone had latched onto an idolatry, blah, 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 blah. If someone had latched onto an idolatry,
Ideology.
Thank you. That's the word I'm trying to say. Idolatry. With fanatic, fever, parasitic possession, how do you suggest promoting self-awareness within that individual and ourselves without assuming a role of threatening superiority or falling into a similar blindness?
That's an excellent question. And I just did an interview with Unsafe Space this past week, which I think will probably come out next week. And they asked this question too. Yelling at people doesn't work. People have to be in a place of openness to engage in reasoned conversation. So that's of limited utility. In Christian ministry, number one, conversion, or a coming out of possession or ideological oppression, requires patience, the work of God, the timing of God, and love. And so I approach this in the same way I approach evangelism. Lots of listening, careful, considered question asking, patience, and love. Now, in terms of politics, you have the right to vote. Vote for whomever you will. The public space affords us a place to speak our minds and share opinions. Share away. Let's use the freedom of speech that we have to, as a community, think together. But when it comes to individual relationships, be gentle and kind and patient. And I think if you are a Christian, prayerful. And just like when I see people, trapped by all sorts of ideologies or bad ideas, the road out of these things is usually slow and painstaking. So be generous and patient and loving. And that usually gets us a lot further than all the usual conflictive traps that we try to play on one another.
Does anybody have a follow-up question or a question in the voice chat? Okay. Well, the next question. Occasionally, Paul, you will, as an aside or a preamble to a question or a commentary, twitch the curtain aside to provide a glimpse into the behind façade view of the world from the pulpit. An example of this from a couple of weeks ago was your emphasizing the pastor's role as a gardener trying to nurture multi-generation community health. Would you care to allow yourself to meander around in relating what kind of experiences, lessons, and perspectives you are uniquely rewarded by your role? Would you agree with emotional custodian or psychic janitor, at least partial description of your duties?
Emotional custodian and psychic janitor. Yeah, those are good. I like those. Well, there's a lot of pastors around, and so my job isn't unusual. And so much of it is so in common with how many other helping people rich professions. How much listening do nurses do? How much listening do teachers do? So when I was talking to Daniel yesterday with the parole officer, he was a young man, and parole officer, he was showing some patience and some deference and some kindness in his role as a parole officer, and I thought that was good. The glimpses that pastors tend to more often be, or often similar to what, let's say, a psychologist would get, except a psychologist is looking with a particular lens on, and a pastor has a different lens. And again, a lot of where I've gone in this, pastors are curators of stories. And I'll tell you, in any storytelling, there's a lot of janitorial or custodial work that needs doing. There's just a lot of people having to get stuff off their chest. So when I came to church this morning and Daniel was out there ranting at me and venting and blowing off steam, I was the proxy for a whole lot of things in his life. But pastors also in that way stand in for Christ, and take the abuse. If you read the Psalms and if you read the Old Testament, God doesn't seem to have a problem, or you read the book of Job, God doesn't seem to have the problem listening to our complaints. And pastors spend a lot of time listening to complaints. And to me, that's sort of the janitorial aspect of the job. That it's not unlike the child that you have who vomits in bed. Well, the parent cleans up the sheets and puts some new sheets on the bed and changes their pajamas, and okay, they got that out of their stomach. They may probably feel a little better. They'll settle down and get some sleep, and maybe in the morning you'll be that much further along in fighting the flu. And so, yeah, we do a lot of emotional custodian or psychic janitorial work. But people need that. But we all need that. And so friends do it, counselors do it, school teachers do it, co-workers do it. And but getting back to an earlier point about enabling, because that is germane there too, at some point the complaining can move from being the vomit that we have to get out of our system to the identity that we begin to indulge in. And that's where pastors have to begin to gain wisdom and courage, and sometimes say a word that productively puts up a mirror to the complaint and say, okay, how much vomiting are you doing of something you need to get out of your stomach? Or how much of this is now becoming a part of your identity, which, if allowed to grow, will manifest into the kind of narcissistic venting that is sort of becoming our collective psyche in these days. And so, yeah. Janitors, on one hand, do clean up messes, and on another hand, sometimes pass the mop to the students and say, clean up your own mess today.
Cool. Well, do we have a question from the voice chat or a follow-up question? Okay. Well, I got one other question for you. It's a follow-up question. Hey, Paul, I wanted to follow up on my previous question. Thank you for your rebuke of my conduct with my fundamentalist friend. It's such a stumbling block for me to not feel superior, which is so stupid of me to think that my intellect would put me in such a position. How would you recommend I combat this? Does this relate to Romans 14 and not putting stumbling blocks in my brother's way?
Well, you've just shown a tremendous amount of exactly what you need in public confession. So I don't know that I have the place to school you on this. It's, if in your opinion at least, you have developed the capacity to understand the Bible historically without tripping over how many Jerichos and the blind man in the New Testament, or the chronology of the synoptics versus the Gospel of John with respect to Holy Week, or Genesis and creation, or if those issues don't trouble you, wow, you've been blessed. And as is always the case, there are some issues that don't trouble us that maybe they should, and those are our growing areas. And so, again, it's a lot of it is first things first. Our values will always, our values, and again, I learned this from Jordan Peterson and Jonathan Peugeot, our values will always line up in a hierarchy. Now, either we can steward that hierarchy or we can be blind to it. And so, from my understanding of Jesus in terms of how we treat other people, love is at the top of the hierarchy. Now, that doesn't necessarily make things simple, because love is by no means a simple thing. And sometimes love requires being an emotional janitor, and sometimes love requires a word of correction or admonition. And again, just like with cheek turning, figuring out which to do when is wisdom, relevance realization, in order to pursue the goal of both of us becoming in increasing measure who God made us to be, bearing witness to the image of Christ in our particular context and contextuality. So just recognizing, just pulling, and I've played these games too, pulling back from some of the cheap tricks. And so often I find this kind of dogpiling, especially on the internet, is a manifestation of pride and ego. I want to look good amongst the people, the smart people I esteem. And it can happen on the other side too. I want to look good amongst the seriously consecrated, sold out Christians that I wish to emulate. And I think we go right to the heart of the Sermon on the Mount, which I'm preaching through now, where Jesus says, do not practice your righteousness in order to gain status in the eyes of others. Don't perform for the clapping gods. Do your righteousness in secret, and your Father, who sees what is done in secret, will reward you. And what that means is that perhaps you will have low status among whichever group it is that you wish to impress, whether they be the highbrow, sophisticated, high in intelligence elite, or the consecrated foot soldier, always reliable, never say quit, legions of people who are not gonna blink when a gun is put to their head. You can see that there's value in both things. So why not recognize in the fundamentalist, you know what? They strive for faithfulness and constancy and shouldering heavy burdens in faithfulness to their Lord. Good for them. And why not esteem in the intellectuals the ongoing rigor and courage that it takes to try to capture every thought to the dominion of Christ? Good for them. Now, why can't I try to be both? Which would mean loving my fundamentalist brothers and sisters and loving my higher criticism brothers and sisters. And if I can, in fact, find pearls among both groups of swine, hey, I'm all the better for it. And, Jesus, at the age of 12, impressed the intelligentsia of the temple, and, was a little bit short with his mom, but I'm not going to criticize Jesus' sonship. So I'd say keep doing what you're doing. Recognize, if you figure out how to love your fundamentalist brother and your modernist brother, and because that's job one.
Sounds good. That was the last text question I have. Does anybody else in voice chat have a question or a follow-up question for Paul?
Yeah, I have a question. Hello, Father Paul.
Hi.
I was reading the Judges, and I'm interested in Gideon's strange choice of weapon when he was fighting Midians. He was using empty pitchers, lamps within the pitchers, and trumpets. What do you think about that?
Look at the history of the Normandy invasion The Allies had an entire fake army at General Patton's command because the Germans thought that he was America's best general. And even after the Normandy invasion began, the Germans held some of those troops, those panzer divisions, up north because they were sure that Calais and the shorter channel crossing and those ports and capturing those ports would be the main immediate objective. Human beings have understood that war is more about information and psychology than it is about swords and blood for a very long time. And Gideon knew this too. So there's lots of stories like that in the Bible where, God throws these overwhelming armies against Israel into confusion, and I think that's always been the case in warfare. So yeah, the Bible is so much fun to read. There's so much in it, and the Book of Judges. Wow, what a book! Amazing.
Thank you very much.
Does anybody else have a question for Paul?
We can be done early today if nobody does. That's absolutely okay. Today's the deadline for my chapter for Vervaeke, and this has been making sloppy, low production quality videos is so much easier than writing.
We have one question pop up in the text chat asking, are you writing a book? I've heard rumors.
I am not writing a book. I am writing a chapter for a book with John Vervaeke and Christopher Mastropietro about some of the stuff that we talk about. And so I agreed to write a chapter, and over the last week I was cursing myself for agreeing to write a chapter. But hopefully, and when I turn it into them, I'm going to say, hey, no skin off my nose if you guys say this doesn't fit into your overall project. I've learned a lot writing the chapter, and I'll probably make a video running the outline of the chapter. But I've learned a lot about myself in the process. So we'll see if it comes to light and if it's helpful for anyone.
I have someone else typing a question. So, does anybody else from the voice chat have a question for Paul? How much wood would a woodchuck chuck if a woodchuck could chuck wood?
Enough.
Yeah.
And no question, but just thank you for all you do, Paul. I think we all feel the same.
Oh, well, I'm amazed that this is happening at all. And so I'm thankful for you guys.
Okay, so we have Freddie, I apologize. Since there is a chance to get to the real question, how do you like your cooked potatoes?
Mash. What is mash them, boil them, stick them in a stew.
Yeah.
I like French fries. I like mashed potatoes. I'd say mashed potatoes are probably with skin on. Depends on the skin. The little thin skins, they're okay. But if you've got those russets with those big heavy skins, take the skins off and make those mashed potatoes nice and creamy and rich. So
We got someone else typing. Find out what they're gonna say in a minute.
If I could ask Paul, do you think if you weren't raised in your denomination, you would end up being the same as you are now?
I find, we can't help but think about these questions because there's enough commonality between us, but it's sort of like saying, asking if I was born a woman or born in Los Angeles instead of Patterson. I mean, how many different things go into us becoming us? So, and this is where, again, I'm very comfortable with God number one, God number two, understanding of He made me and He keeps making me and He keeps remaking me. So I have friends, I have many friends who are no longer part of the Christian Reformed Church. I have many friends and people close to me who have given up the gospel and given up Christianity. Why have I been such? Why have I remained and others have left? I can't answer that, and I look at God.
Well, I wasn't thinking you might go atheist on us. I was wondering more along the lines of, do you think maybe you might have ended up being like a Catholic priest or, something like that?
I think when I was in my 20s, I didn't really have a lot of ambitions towards celibacy. It's really hard because now, because of many of you, I've got a far greater understanding and appreciation for the riches of the other traditions. But at the same time, these things they're not like on teeter-totters or seesaws. I don't appreciate my tradition less because I appreciate the wealth of the Orthodox and the Roman Catholics and the Mennonites more. It's not a competition. So, and to what degree am I Christian Reformed as compared to others of my colleagues who don't sound like me? So all of the experience that I have had from Patterson to Calvin College and Seminary to the Dominican Republic to Sacramento have gone into making me who I am right now, answering these questions. So I always find these questions, if I had lost a child, how would that impact my faith? Those are hard things.
So, does anybody else have a question for Paul?
I wondered if I did this every week if I would exhaust you guys. I'd say we've come to the end of the questions, at least for now.
Yep, I would agree.
Unless someone's trying to talk there. I see the light going on, but maybe it's a mic problem. Trixie. Someone's typing. All right. If there are no more questions in the next moment or two, we'll call it a day, and that will encourage me. Any planned talks with Peugeot? There's this big conference that Vervaeke and Peugeot and I were going to go to in Thunder Bay. I haven't heard from them, but it seems completely unlikely that will come to be. Jonathan and I don't have another online talk scheduled right now. That usually kind of happens when either he or I have something in mind that we've caught the other doing, and want to talk to each other, and so then we do that. So nothing planned. I watch Jonathan's channel pretty regularly, and again, I've very much grown from his work. So nope, nothing planned at this point. We'll see. I was really happy with the unsafe space conversation. I didn't know how that would go, but I was pleased with how that went. I'm seeing what happened to Jordan, a little skittish about getting too much in the political realm. I don't think it can be ignored, but I'm primarily a pastor and not a political person or a political identity. So, all right.
Yep.
If that's it, we'll call it a day. Now, like I said, I'm working with Cassidy on a new format for this, which will be much more discussion. So I think Cassidy will roll out something, and maybe in coming weeks we'll try some of that. So thank you all for coming, and we will probably next Friday either we'll do this again or we'll do something slightly different.